lovely feet. Our feet do such an amazing job for us day in, day out, taking our body weight, being slapped about on concrete, not to mention all the things we do to them as dancers. We really need to take a moment to understand them, figure out how they work, so we can best protect them, but also optimize them, get the most out of them. Now, what you're going to see as you go through all the videos on this site is that pretty much everything relates back to the feet. Whatever issues you may have going on further up the body, often the source will be at the foot. It's most of the time the only point of contact we have with a solid surface. Yes, of course, we do floor work, we do arm weight-bearing work as well in dance, but the majority of the time we're feet to the ground. So they're setting up the architecture above them. They are the foundation that sets up our biomechanics all the way through the body. Even if I've got somebody coming in with a neck problem, I'm going to look at their feet. How did the story of the symptoms at the neck begin? And we have to go right back to the source. That's the feet. This video is therefore going to be really important for you to keep revisiting. The anatomy of the foot is very complicated. It's very complex, but getting a global sense of it, to just start really wide and broad and get a broad understanding of how the foot is operating. And then you can keep coming deeper and deeper as your knowledge widens. All right. Are you ready? Let's go in and have a look at the bones of the foot to start. Now, the foot's made up of about 26 bones on average, and that's because we need our feet to be really kind of malleable. If we just had like one bone or two bones in our foot and we're walking around on uneven ground, we're designed, right, to be on terrain and kind of on earthy ground, shifting sands. If you just had one or two bones, you'd be really precarious, right? You'd be tipping over all the time. With 26 bones, we've got the ability to absorb and accommodate those surfaces and keep ourselves in balance. If you go and look at the Meet Your Soft Tissues video and look at ligaments, you'll see how the ligaments that connect these bones really play a role in that balance feedback system. But we need that maneuverability in the foot for that reason. That also gives us good shock absorption. As dancers, often we're jumping, right? We're putting a lot of force through the body as we're landing from jumps. Therefore, we need the motion of the foot and all this absorption capacity of the foot to protect everything above it. If the foot shock absorption mechanism is working well, it protects the knees, the hips, the spine, the neck, and everything along that chain. Take a broad look. There's lots of crazy terms here on the page, but just take a broad look at the kind of shape of these bones we have in the foot. If you look at that left-hand picture of the foot, you're basically looking at a right foot top down. If you look straight down at your feet and take away your lower leg, then you're looking at that kind of angle, that viewpoint. You'll notice at the back of the foot, the heel area, the calcaneus is the big heel bone that strikes the floor when we walk. It's big, right? It takes typically a lot of the load because typical walking patterns are heel to toe. As dancers, we always like to do things differently, right? So we often more likely go toe to heel, which means we need a lot of strength in our feet to protect the smaller bones at the front that weren't really designed to take that kind of load. So we have that calcaneus, the big bone there. Sitting on top of it, we have the talus, which is the ankle bone in the middle. And that is the one, when we point our feet, rolls nicely forward, and often the one that gives us the nice line of a pointed foot. Then as you get towards the middle of the foot, if you think of what we call the instep in dancers, the sort of arch over the top of the foot, that's made up of these smaller bones that I kind of refer to as the pebbles or the stones in the foot. They're like little small stones. And they form this middle part of the foot that again has this malleable capacity. Then as you get towards the front of the foot, you've got the long bones, the metatarsals. Most dancers are familiar with that term. We talk about the metatarsals quite often. And they're very similar to the long bones in the back of the hand. They've got that, they're basically bridging the gap between those middle arch bones through to the toes. And when we're on a rise on the balls of the feet, we're essentially on the ends of those metatarsal bones. Then we get down to the toes, which are obviously very similar to our fingers as well. And just like our fingers, if you look at your thumb, you've got two bones, right? Just one knuckle and two bones. Same with the big toe. Two bones, one knuckle. When you look at all the other toes, you've actually got three bones and two knuckles, right? Just like the second through fifth finger. Even in your tiny little baby toe, you've got three little bones in there. So they're really quite small. So you're looking at that architecture from the heel to the front of the foot with the bigger, chunkier bones towards the back, going forward and spreading out to these more tiny little bones towards the front of the foot. That little X-ray picture you can see there in the far left of the picture where it says sesamoid bones, that's looking at the underneath of your big toe joint where those two red arrows are, because underneath that big toe joint you've got two what are called sesamoid bones. They're also known as floating bones. They're again like little tiny pebbles that sit under the big toe and they're sort of suspended within the soft tissues there. The reason I've flagged them up there is some people can get irritation of those bones. If you've been bashing around on that kind of demi-point rise position, they can get bruised sometimes. And we call this sesamoiditis. Itis just means inflammation of whatever comes before it. Appendicitis, bronchitis, tonsillitis, right? Sesamoiditis, inflammation of the sesamoid bones. I'll do a whole video on sesamoiditis in case that's something you've experienced. In that right-hand picture, we've got the side view of the foot, of the outside of your foot. And again, that's a right foot side view from the outside. And it gives you an idea of how we have this arch shape from heel to toe. The heel's in contact, the middle foot rises up a little and then drops down towards the toes. And again, this is really important. We're going to come on to the arches of the foot more specifically in a moment, but it's really important that we have that available to us for shock absorption. Okay. So that's a little overview of the bones. Now let's look at the ligaments. Now the ligaments connect bones to bones. Wherever you've got a bone meeting another bone at a joint, you'll have ligaments there. And they're there to allow for some range of motion. So we are allowed to play around with a little bit of motion between those bones, but they're going to limit us from going too far. So they provide what we call the passive stability. Passive because they can't contract like a muscle does and move these joints. They're literally like kind of leather straps that strap the joint together, allow a little bit of motion but not too much. They're very much involved in our balance mechanism. The foot is incredibly important for balance because it's setting up everything above it. Go and watch the balance video to learn more about that. But that's one of the major roles of the ligaments in the foot. They're also prone to injury, particularly with us and the kind of things we do with our feet. Go and watch the ankle sprain video to find out a little bit more how ligaments get injured and what we can do to help heal them once they've been injured and get our strength and balance systems back online. So that's the ligaments. They've all got crazy names. I'm not going to put them all in here because your eyes would cross, basically. Let's have a look at another structure that's very important in the foot, and it's called the plantar fascia. Anything that says plantar refers to the sole of the foot, the part of your foot that plants itself into the ground. All these crazy anatomical names do actually have a logic when you figure them out, and they make more sense once you know that. Fascia is because it's made of fascial tissue. If you don't know what fascia is, Go and watch the video. I've done a whole video on fascia because it's such an important structure and often very overlooked by us and people in general. Actually, we're very focused on our muscles and our tendons. We don't often talk about the fascia, but it's very, very important in the structural connections through the body. In this instance, we're looking at this band of fascia that runs from your heel bone, that calcaneus, through to the balls of the feet. So it's kind of triangular because it starts more narrowly at the heel and fans out towards the balls of the feet under all the toes. And it's there to support the long arch of the foot. We'll look at those arches in more detail in a moment. It's there for shock absorption. So as you're landing and you want that nice sort of juicy elastic quality, it's there to allow for a little give, but it's a bit like a ligament in the sense that it doesn't stretch like a muscle would. It'll give a little bit, but it's going to create some tensile strength so that we don't just collapse into our 26 bones when we land from a jump, for instance. It's going to create a little bit of what we call recoil in the system. The middle part of that foot that's made up of all those lovely bones, if your foot is just in a loose, relaxed position, you can move all those bones around on each other. It's just like a little bag of pebbles at that point. When we go into the position that you see on the right-hand picture there, we call that toe off, what we would sort of call a rise position. But if you're running, your back foot is going to that toe off position before you spring forward for your next step. If you just had a loose bag of bones in your feet, you'd have to be kind of picking up and slapping them down, and it wouldn't be very efficient. When you go to that rise or toe off position, you can try it. If you grab hold of your foot and bend your toes up, like into a rise position, and try and move your arch when it's in that position, you'll find that it becomes very rigid. So it turns that loose bag of bones into a rigid lever that'll propel you for your next run, jump, whatever movement you're doing. So it increases efficiency in the body. It can get prone to inflammation because it's under our foot. And if you've ever had inflammation of this, it's called plantar fasciitis. Again, itis means inflammation of the plantar fascia. Go and watch the video on plantar fasciitis to find out more about that. But it gets very painful. And you don't like to go to that rise or toe off position because it irritates the plantar fascia, and therefore you have to kind of like pick up your foot and put it down. And it actually uses a lot more energy to do that because we have to use more muscle effort than just natural propulsion. So very important for our biomechanics. The arches of the foot. Typically as dancers, we're very familiar with the inside arch, what's known as the medial longitudinal arch. If you look at the bottom left there where it says medial view, medial just means towards the middle. So if you were standing in parallel, it's the arch of the foot towards the middle of the body. We also have a lateral arch, which is towards the side. Lateral means to the side. So you've got the two views there. The medial one is typically higher, and the one that we're always kind of looking for, particularly in ballet, right, to have that nice arch of the foot. Everybody's different, right? We're all anatomically unique. Some people have a very naturally high arch. Some people have a naturally flatter arch, and that's not a problem. Just because the arch is a bit lower, the question is it functional? That's what we want to be looking at. The higher arches, basically you're looking at from that heel bone lifting up through to your big toe joint, essentially. On the outer side of the foot, we also have that subtle arch, and it's running from the heel bone again down to the toe, but not quite so noticeable. But we also have crossways arches, and these are the ones that dancers often don't know about. We're often familiar with the idea we have the instep, right, this kind of arch on the top of the foot. That's obviously mirrored by an arch underneath it, like a bridge. So in that middle part of the foot, we have a crosswise arch. Similarly, under the toe joint, so under those balls of the feet, what are called the heads of the metatarsals where they meet the toes, there also should be another very subtle arch from the big toe through to the little toe. That can sometimes get dropped. A lot of these arches can become dropped. you might have had that experience sometimes where you're on a rise and you find like one of those metatarsals is kind of drilling into the floor and it can get bruised and inflamed. That's typically when one of those metatarsals has dropped down a bit. Often it happens with the second toe. I see that quite often. So you need some manual therapy to help relocate that metatarsal, get that arch back into play and offload that one metatarsal that's kind of taking the load of all the others. All of these arches can become a little droopy sometimes. Again, just because your arch is a little flatter, that might be natural for you. I'm interested in whether it's functional, and if you're getting pain with the arch and the arch has flattened a bit, then it may be because some of these bones have got a bit squashed down. They all get a bit jiggled on each other sometimes, and we can get a flattening of the arch like in that far right hand position. Sometimes dancers who retire, when you're training, we're going to look at the muscles of the foot in a moment. When you're training, you've got lots of tone in the muscles that support the arch. Then often when dancers retire, having had no foot problems their whole career, suddenly they retire and they're like, my feet hurt, because they're not training anymore. The muscle tone has dropped and suddenly those bones have started to sag a bit. And one of the things people often report is that they go up a shoe size, or the shoes don't fit as well because the bones are kind of flattened and it's made the foot a bit longer, and they can't understand why they can't fit in their shoes anymore. So interesting to note, we always say old dancers can never retire, right? You've got to keep some tone around these loose joints that we train ourselves to have. Let's take a look at the muscles. Now, don't get overwhelmed. There's a lot of muscles here and they all have these crazy long names, but just keep your view wide, go for a broad overview of what's going on, and then every time you revisit this anatomy, you can go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. But let's start with that top image where we're looking at the top part of the foot, which in anatomical terms we call the dorsal surface. If you think of the dorsal fins of a shark, they're on its back, right? They're on the top. Now, we've chopped up these videos into the foot that we're looking at here, and we've got a separate one on the ankle anatomy. And obviously there's a lot of crossover here. It's just that there's too much to fit all of that in one video. But don't get an artificial idea that the muscles that operate the ankle are separate from the foot. There's a lot of crossover. So watch both these videos in tandem to get a unified view of what's going on. But on the top of the foot, the muscles that bring the ankle into what we call dorsiflexion, so we're flexing that foot upwards in the direction of that dorsal surface. We've also got muscles on the top there that pull the toes up in the air. And this in anatomical language is actually called toe extension, which is a little confusing because we've got dorsiflexion of the ankle, bringing the foot up towards the shin area, and extension of the toes, bringing the toes up towards the shin area. We're going to look in more detail at these long muscles in a moment, but just to give you an idea that the muscles on the top of the foot are bringing everything upwards towards the shin, whereas the lower three images here are the muscles that are doing the pointing of the foot. Now, we talked about the sole of the foot being the plantar surface because it plants itself towards the floor. So when we talk about pointing the foot in dance language, we're actually referring to something that's called plantar flexion, pointing the foot in the plantar direction. Under the sole of the foot, we've got several layers of muscle that are all involved in the pointing motion, but also in supporting the arches of the foot that we've already looked at. We already looked at that plantar fascia, and in this first image down at the bottom here, we're looking at the sole of the foot with that plantar fascia removed. In this image, it's called the plantar aponeurosis, which is another fancy term for the plantar fascia. That's been cut away, so you can see this first layer of muscle that's underneath that. Between your plantar fascia that you can touch with your hands, you can feel it with your hands, between that and the bones of the arch of the foot, there are all these muscles. There's a lot going on here. These muscles here, you'll see the flexor digitorum brevis, for example. Flexor means that plantar flexion direction, pointing in our language. Digitorum, remember your toes are called the digits. Brevis means short, okay? And that means there's obviously a long one as well, which we'll see in a moment. So the flexor digitorum brevis is partly there to support the arch of the foot and give us that lovely doming of the arch of the foot, but will also act to point the toes, but its tendons only go as far as the middle bone. Remember, we've got 3 bones in each toe. It only goes to the middle bone, so it's just pointing as far as that. But we want these muscles, along with those other ones you see there, to be lovely and strong to support this arch. In the middle picture here, we've got a deeper layer. So if you take away those ones we've just looked at, these ones are underneath. And where you see the lumbricals there, these are muscles that sit between those long metatarsal bones. If we go to that deepest layer on the far right there, we see some more flexor muscles. Hallucis, as we'll see in a moment, the hallux is the big toe, so a hallucis muscle goes to your big toe and flexes it, points it, and on the other side, the flexor digiti minimi brevis. So digiti minimi, your little toe. So that's one that points your little toe. So these are just layers of muscle. You don't need to remember all these fancy names, but they mainly support that arch. They're really important to us, and I'll be showing you an exercise for these later on, but they're not operating all the way to the far ends of the toes. The muscles that do go to the far end of the toes are these lovely guys. And we've got lovely spinning images here so we can get a 3D view. You'll notice that the bellies of these muscles are up in the back of the shin area. These are underneath your calf muscles that you can kind of touch and feel. Deep to those, you'll find these guys. Let's start with that flexor digitorum longus on the left there. Again, flexor, it points your foot, plantar flexes. Digitorum, toes. Longus, because remember we had a brevis one. So this is the long one because it's obviously travelling a lot further. That muscle starts on the back of your tibia, the shin bone, and as you can see, it comes around the inside ankle bone where it becomes a tendon. Go and look at the Meet Your Soft Tissues video to get the distinction between muscles and tendons. But you'll see it's a singular tendon around that ankle bone, but then it divides up and goes into 4 slips that go to toes number 2 through 5. So your second toe through to your little toe. Now this muscle is mainly working on the ankle, and we'll look at it again in the ankle video. So it will plantar flex that ankle, point your ankle downwards, but it will also point those toes downwards. And what you can see is that this muscle goes right to the end digit of your toes, whereas the shorter ones in the last slide only went to the second bone of your toes. Now this is the one we have to be mindful of, that we don't exploit it to curl our toes. More of that in just a moment. Now that one went to toes 2 to 5, so we've got a similar one that operates your big toe. The hallux is the fancy name for your big toe, so where you see a muscle that's called a hallucis muscle, it's operating your big toe. This one is the flexor hallucis longus. So the flexor, it points your big toe, and it's the long one because on the previous slide we saw we had a brevis, a short one as well. Again, this one starts up in the back of that shin area, and it's actually attaching to the fibula bone, that little splint bone in the lower leg. Remember, we've got 2 bones in the lower leg, and it wraps around that inside ankle bone again, and then along the arch of the foot that we already looked at, so it's tracking along that medial longitudinal arch and ending up at your big toe, and its action is to pull that toe downwards, but again it also helps to point the ankle. This brings us on to the issue of toe scrunching. This is a no-no in dance for many reasons. We want the toes, when we're pointing our feet, to be in line with the foot. The arch provides that curved shape, but the toes really want to be pointing straight down towards the floor. If we're over-recruiting that long muscle, remember that flexor digitorum longus and also your flexor hallucis longus we just looked at, those allow us to curl the toes under, like in this right hand picture. We don't want to do that for many reasons. We're shortening the muscles. Remember, dancers' muscles need to be long and strong. This can lead us towards cramping issues, but also it has larger implications. As we saw, those longest muscles operate the ankle. If you're cranking your toes underneath you, you're crunching up into the back of the ankle, and it can lead to something called ankle impingement. And this is something that can be quite serious and can even need surgery in some cases. And I had that surgery myself, so this is why I'm quite passionate about not doing this. Another reason is just it doesn't give a good line. If you're a classical dancer and you're going to be doing point work, then if you look at the knuckles curled under here, if you want to go up into point, if your toes are used to pointing by curling under, on point you'd be standing on your knuckles, and we know we're not supposed to be doing that. We need to build the strength with our toes in that lengthened orientation in order that when you're on point, that you're not collapsing into those toes. It also goes towards the line of the leg. If you've got your leg in an extension to the front, to the side, wherever, if you're curling the toes under, it gives you a tendency to start to cramp up into the calf muscle and even up into the hamstring muscles, and you're almost starting to bend the knee and shorten the leg line. So many reasons why we do not want to be scrunching our toes. Here's a little exercise you can do to help you figure that, and we call it foot doming. You're wanting to lift the arch of the foot, so we're exercising those short muscles, but without curling the toes. So this first version, we're going to see we lift the arch, but the toes are long, they're in extension. This way, we're curling the toes. Don't want to do that, right? That's a scrunching position. So see if you can do that. Can you lift the arch keeping the toes in alignment, or do you find yourself wanting to scrunch? If you're finding it difficult, the best trick to get it, because it's a bit like patting your head and rubbing your stomach to try and separate out these movements. If you actually hold your toes down with your finger when it's in the flat position and do that doming and hold your toes down and don't allow them to scrunch, and then eventually you'll be able to get the strength in those muscles to lift the arch without scrunching the toes. Great exercise to do to improve the strength in your feet. Again, great for landing from jumps, all sorts of things. Okay, now we've got the reverse muscles. Remember, muscles work in pairs. Go and watch the muscles video to find out that. But we've often got reflections of muscle groups on the opposite sides of the body doing the opposite motion. So we looked at the muscles that point. Now we're going to look at the muscles that extend. Let's set these ones spinning. So these ones are on the front of the lower leg, on the shin area. We've got less muscle there because we haven't got our big fleshy calf muscles like we have at the back. These are deep to the tibialis anterior muscle, which is the one you can feel on the front of your shin. They're kind of underneath that. And they're just the reverse, the reflection of what we looked at. On the left-hand side, extensor, because what we call in dance flexing the foot is kind of reverse in anatomical terms. We call it extending the foot. or the toes in this case. Extensor digitorum, again, the toes, longus, and it's doing the pull-up of toes 2 to 5. And similarly on the right, we have the extensor hallucis longus, pulling up your big toe. So muscles on the back pull the foot down, muscles on the front pull the foot and the toes up. Little exercise for you here to separate those out as well. Can you just isolate that big toe muscle and then isolate the other 4 toes? You've seen that they all share one tendon and one muscle. See if you can do this little exercise where you lift up your big toe, then you lift up the other 4 toes. Let's see that again. Lift up your big toe, lift up your other 4 toes. Have a play with that. It's always good to separate out these muscles. If you want to know how to stretch out these muscles, watch the stretch series in the lower leg section and you'll see exercises. We can't always stretch these muscles because of where they're located, but there are release techniques that you can use to help drop the tension out of these if you're getting any kind of tension. The foot is the key and the gateway to the rest of the body. Get to know your feet, give them some foot love, and your body will thank you for it.